Today we are going to read the story, We the People, the Story of Our Constitution by Lynn Cheney. Astride his favorite horse, Nelson General George Washington looked on as thousands of British soldiers marched out of the Yorktown, Virginia to lay down their arms. It was October 19, 1781, and America, with help from France, had just won the battle of the end of the Revolutionary War. For the British, the loss was a shock. Theirs was the mightiest army in the world, and they had thought it was impossible that the Americans would defeat them. According to traditions, the soldiers marching out of Yorktown to surrender played a song called "The World Turned Upside Down." For citizens of our country, living on a vast and bountiful continent, it seemed a new age was dawning. A free and independent America would surely prosper and become a great and mighty nation. The citizens of America are from this period to be considered as the actors on a most conspicuous theater, which seems to be peculiarly designed by Providence for the display of human greatness and felicity. George Washington. But over the next several years, trouble became apparent. America had adopted rules for governing called the Articles of Confederation, and they didn't work very well. Congress, which was supposed to be in charge of the Confederation or Union of States, did not have enough power. It could not prevent states from printing their own money. It could not get them to help defend America or to pay off debts from the Revolutionary War. Other countries, sensing the weakness of the United States, took advantage of this. The British refused to move out of military posts they were supposed to give up after the Revolutionary War. In Massachusetts, farmers who couldn't pay their debts rose up against the government. When they tried to seize a building in Springfield where guns and ammunition were kept, militia fired upon them. Americans were killing Americans. Was our country, which had so recently won its independence, now going to come apart? In 1787, delegates from 12 states traveled to a convention in Philadelphia to figure out a better plan for governing the country. Congress had instructed them to revise the Articles of Confederation, but some were thinking well beyond that. James Madison of Virginia, the first delegate to arrive from out of town, had studied how nations worked and was convinced America needed as much stronger government than the Articles had provided, and soon. The current government, he believed, was near to collapse. In his room at Philadelphia boarding house, Madison, a small man of great learning, labored over a plan to present to the convention. His boldest idea was that the nation's government start with the people. As it was, state legislatures were choosing the government of Congress. Madison proposed that the people have direct say in who represents them. George Washington, who had returned to private life after the Revolutionary War, arrived in Philadelphia on May 13th, the day before the convention was scheduled to begin. Although he didn't like leaving his beloved home at Mount Vernon, Washington, came to the convention because he was worried. 13 states, all pulling in different directions, were bringing up ruin upon America, he believed. Bells rang out to celebrate Washington's arrival, and joyful crowds gathered to meet him. The people of Philadelphia remembered how this tall, dignified man had presented the darkest hours of the Revolution, when it had seemed impossible that America would win the war for their independence. They remembered how he had given up power after the war when some had wanted to make him a king. All across America he was loved and respected, which made his presence in Philadelphia especially important. With him at the convention, Americans were more likely to look favorably upon them when the delegates decided. Not until May 25th, 11 days after the convention was supposed to start, were there enough delegates for it to begin. 29 men gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, elected George Washington the convention's president, and made rules, including one that pledged them all to secrecy. James Madison had used the time leading up to the convention to present his ideas to his fellow Virginians, and on May 29th, one of the Virginia representatives proposed Madison's plan to the assembled delegates. As Madison, seated closest to George Washington, took notes, Governor Edmund Randolph described a government of 3 branches: legislative, or the Congress, judicial, or the courts, and a national executive. The legislative branch would have 2 parts, or houses, with the people of each state electing the number of the first house. Some delegates argued that the people couldn't be trusted to choose their representatives, but most disagreed. They thought that the place for government to begin was with the people. What nearly brought this convention to an end was the idea of the large states becoming more powerful. Under the Articles of Confederation, every state had one vote, but the Virginia plan gave more representatives and more votes to the states with more people. Delegates from larger states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, thought that was only fair, but delegates from the smaller states believed that their interests would be trampled upon. William Paterson of New Jersey, scolding the delegates for going so far beyond the Articles of Confederation, presented a plan that preserved equality in voting. It was rejected, but the small states would not give up, and delegates continued to argue bitterly. The oldest delegate was inventor and statesman Benjamin Franklin. At 81, he had trouble walking and was carried in a sedan chair from his home to the convention. Franklin commanded great respect, but not even he could get quarreling delegates to put their anger aside. Through most of June they fought, their tempers made worse by hot weather. It was swirling as the Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed that in one house of the legislative, states be represented according to size, and in other, the Senate, each state have an equal number of votes. But the idea went nowhere. Larger states were not willing to give up anything to the smaller ones. Dr. Franklin suggested that delegates send for the chaplain to lead them in prayer. The leaders of the revolution had sought God's help, he said, and so should those who were trying to build a new nation. The delegates did not send for a chaplain, but as the 4th of July neared, they did not stop arguing long enough to appoint a committee to seek a way out of their difficulties. Acting on a suggestion by Dr. Franklin, the committee crafted what became known as the Great Compromise. It made Dr. Sherman's proposal more appealing to large states by having all legislation concerning money begin in the first house of the legislature, where big states had more power. One evening in his garden, Dr. Franklin showed visitors a curiosity someone had sent him, a two-headed snake preserved in a vial. Such a creature made the point, he said, that compromise was often crucial to progress. But when the committee took its suggestion for compromise back to the convention, delegates from large states still resisted. Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, a tall, commanding man with a wooden leg, was particularly angry that small states were threatening to form a separate union unless there was equal voting in the senates. The country would be united one way or another, he said, offering a threat of his own. If persuasion does not unite, the sword will. Delegates also fell to quarreling about who should be counted in order to figure out how many representatives a state should have. Southerners wanted to count slaves so that their states would have more representative. Northerners, especially those who hated slavery, objected, not wanting to give the South more power. It seemed as though the convention might fall apart, and with it, the country. With failure looking, a few delegates had change of heart. In a close and momentous vote on July 16th, the convention adopted the Great Compromise. In one house, states would represent according to population, and in the other, they would have an equal number of votes. To determine how many representatives a state would have, the convention decided to count 3/5 of the slaves. This compromise meant that the South would be part of the new government, but some delegates hated the bargain. Slavery was an evil institution, Governor Morris raged, the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Such words would ring out of the state house again when the delegates debated a ban on bringing more slaves into the country. The convention decided that there could be no ban on for 20 years. The delegates moved on to other decisions, and by July 26, they were ready to have a group called the Committee of Detail to go work. Organizing the points that the delegates had agreed to, the members of the committee, headed by John Rutledge of South Carolina, wrote the first draft of the Constitution. They named parts of the government and certain offices that the delegates had created, calling the first House of Congress the House of Representatives and its leaders the Speaker. They called the highest body in the judicial branch the Supreme Court and named the head of the executive branch the President of the United States. While members of the committee were at work, other delegates took a break. George Washington went fishing. Gathering again on August 6 to talk about the draft constitution, delegates soon took up a question they had discussed many times before. How should the president be elected? Should state legislators make the choice, or members of Congress? They finally agreed on a system of elections that would allow the president to be chosen indirectly by the people. The delegates also decided that the people should be in charge of ratifying the Constitution. Rather than seek the approval of state legislature, delegates choose to submit the Constitution to specifically elected conversations in every state. When the Committee of Style and Arrangement, the delegates assigned to write the final version of the Constitution, got to work. They emphasized at the beginning of the document that the Constitution would become supreme law only when the people decided it should be so. On September 17th, after the final draft of the Constitution was read aloud, Benjamin Franklin addressed the convention. He told the delegates that there were parts of the document with which he did not agree, but that was over long life he had learned he was not always right. On the whole, he said, the Constitution was astonishingly good, and he hoped that the other delegates who had doubts would join him in signing it. Several refused, including Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts and George Mason of Virginia, who wanted the Constitution explicitly to set forth the rights of individuals. George Washington, as president of the convention, was the first to put his name to the Constitution. Then 37 others followed, state by state. As the last delegate signed the document, Dr. Franklin looked at the sun painted on the back of George Washington's chair and saw a sign of a new beginning for America. By July 4th, 1788, the people of 10 states had, after sometimes fierce debate, ratified the Constitution. Since only 9 states were required to make the Constitution the supreme law of the country, it was time for a celebration. In Philadelphia, after early morning bells and canyon salute, crowds lined the streets to watch high-stepping horses lead a parade of flags, bands, and floats. The Grand Federal Edifice, a specifically constructed building honoring the Union, passed by, pulled by 10 white horses. A carved and painted 20-gun ship, the Union, made its way through town on its carriage. Citizens of every occupation marched, weavers followed by chair makers, bricklayers and gilders, bookbinders by coppersmiths and clergymen. And at the end of the parade came feasting and an orientation. Happy country, proclaimed convention delegate James Wilson. May thy happiness be perpetual. Under the Constitution, America would become the nations George Washington imagined, a place of freedom in which people can aspire to high goals and seek happiness, a country exemplifying the blessings of ordered liberty. But the Constitution had the delegates signed in Philadelphia in 1787 was not perfect, and being aware of that, delegates included in the Constitution ways of changing or amending it. The first 10 amendments, called the Bill of Rights, were passed by 2/3 of Congress in 1789 and ratified by 3/4 of the states in 1791. Providing protection for the many rights we have as individuals, they include safeguards for freedom of speech, religion, and the press. Amendments added after the Civil War did away with slavery and provided the right to vote will not be restricted on account of race. In 1920, the Constitution was amended to recognize the right of women to vote. The document created in Philadelphia in 1787 has changed as our country has changed, growing injustice over the years. Once there were Americans who looked at the Constitution and did not see it for themselves. Today, we the people include all of us working together to make our country greater still.